Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's David, and in the midst of the pandemic, I'm speaking to you from Germany rather than talking with you in Manchester. And either above me or below me, I'm not quite sure which, there'll be a picture of my working colleague, Denise. We work together for Temper Domestic Violence, a program working with domestic abusers, a so-called Perpetrator program. Hi, Denise.
Thank you, David. Yes, I'm Denise Knowles, and I've been working with David for what sometimes feels like a lifetime, but a long time. And before that, I was working with Relate, working as a couples counsellor. The lockdown is creating one or two tensions, I will say, but it is good to be doing this, and I'm pleased to be able to present to you all in Manchester. Over to you, David.
Denise and I are going to talk to you today on the topic of domestic violence, in which we are specialists. We work together for a very small charity, delivering a program working mainly with domestic abusers, a so-called Perpetrator program, a DAPP, a Domestic Abuse Perpetrator program. We are one of very few programs altogether, and we are not accredited to Respect. Respect is a charity which accredits abuser programs. The reasons for this will become clear as we move along. In the interests of children, families and society as a whole, our plan is to address the issues of how work with abusers and perpetrators in dedicated programs can be carried out much better than the way the accredited programs do. So one part of this talk will illustrate why work should also be available to female abusers and perpetrators, and required of them too. Additionally, we will explain some of the fundamental things which are wrong with the Duluth model, which has formed the basis of virtually all the other programs, and particularly its focus on power and control, which forms the basis of what the radical branch of feminists choose to see as the underlying cause of all domestic abuse. We will outline what we think is needed in terms of a focus for therapeutically informed work with abusers and perpetrators. My 25 years working on this and our joint 24 years revising and developing the program as we go along leaves us in no doubt of its overall effectiveness, believing that to be about 70% overall. Before we dive into the subject in more detail, I think it would be very wise to point out, for the sake of a much wider society, that the vast majority of men and women that separate do so fairly amicably in about 95% plus of cases. High conflict develops between the individuals involved in the remaining 5% of cases to a greater or lesser degree in each individual case. So let's get a definition first of some of the words. A perpetrator is someone who's committed a criminal offense. He will have been accused, charged, gone to court, and been found guilty. A victim is someone who has suffered a crime. Less than 2% of domestic violence cases are prosecuted, and about 50% of those prosecuted result in a conviction. So about 1% of abusers are, technically speaking, perpetrators. One part of a narrative has been the careful labeling of all males as perpetrators and all females as victims of those male perpetrators. The vast majority of so-called perpetrators are in fact not perpetrators, but people who have been using or been accused of engaging in abusive behaviours. So Denise and I have completed 36 hours of therapeutically informed work with more than 1,000 men and more than 100 women in mixed gender groups. In 1994, as a Relate counsellor, I and a number of my colleagues attended a conference on domestic violence in Northampton. There were two main speakers, Miss Sandra Hawley, whose messages were, "Violent men are all the same and they won't change. The only thing for a woman to do is to leave him." And her other message was, 2 women per week are killed on average by their husband or partner or former husband or partner. A guy called Mr. Luke Daniels spoke about the work of the Everyman Centre in London, working with men to change their violent behaviours. With the excellent training I'd received from Relate in couple counselling and a very important course I'd attended in the late 70s, I was certain that most men could change their behaviours and that Miss Hawley's message needed to be contradicted. A further message of Miss Hawley's of that time was that only 4.7% of domestic violence was by women to men. From within Relate, my experience and my colleagues' experiences flew in the face of what Miss Hawley was saying, and following the meeting, we decided to do something about it. We knew firsthand that women were just as capable of being violent and aggressive as men. So in writing the course, which we knew would be mainly targeted at men, we also had to be carefully aware of not excluding women. So we didn't. Why would we have? Up until about 2005, 10% of our clients in Northamptonshire were women, many of them referred by social services. And when we moved the programme from Luton to the West Midlands in about 1997, 15% of our clients in the West Midlands were female. In constructing a programme, we eventually settled on the name Heart of England Model. Two reasons for this: one, the location, and two, the underlying recognition that emotions drive most behaviours. Our next problem was to decide on an amount of time. 40 hours seemed about right. The Change project, one of the first, which had been researched by Dobash and Dobash, had also been of about 40 hours. For reasons best known to themselves, other programs and those accredited projects have settled on 75 hours. We offered early clients 5 potential timeframes. The clients opted for 2 weekends. We knew from experience that both genders were capable of violence, so the work was offered in a mixed group. We were very experienced at working with men and women together. Part of what we also considered necessary was that each gender needed to learn something of the ways of the other gender, all of which, plus the model of a male and female working constructively together, we thought would be beneficial to most cases. Therapeutically, of course, the model also replicates something of a heterosexual family, with clients moving between the positions of adults and children according to the work being carried out at any particular moment. Which categories of risk would our clients be in? Mainly normal and medium. About 50% of our early clients were being referred by Relate counsellors. The high risk end were more likely to have been in the court system and likely to have been convicted, and consequently be being worked with by the probation service or the early community-based programs. The Duluth Perpetrator program had been developed in America despite no positive research. It became a near ubiquitous response. There was always criticism about the numbers of dropouts, but nevertheless it was imported into Britain with permission from Women's Aid and Refuge. Over 26 to 32 weeks at 2 to 2.5 hours per week, it focused entirely on men, male dominance, and the exercise of male power and control over a female victim. Since the early work was directed mainly at probation service clients, there were and remain aspects of it which were punitive and which focused on making the criminal pay. And another aspect involved with probation style work is supervision, and an aspect of the Duluth program and its hybrids is also an attempt at supervision. Assessing potential risk in any meaningful way is a very difficult subject and can get in the way of a client's willingness and ability to learn and make changes. So we developed an application form which focused on whether the work we undertake would be beneficial to the individual and whether the individual would be likely to learn from it. Had we seen a clinical psychologist's detailed report of a very early client, we would probably not have worked with him based on that. However, that individual made the most profound changes which have been sustained over the last 20 years. Denise is now going to talk briefly on an underlying piece of psychological research, laying the basis for our work.
Thank you, David. The Heart of England model is a therapeutically informed way of working. And when we talk about therapeutically working with people, this is about getting alongside them. It's about developing a relationship with them. It's about being able to help them define what they want as an outcome, and then helping them to put together a plan that will give them the desired outcome. And in order for all of that to happen, some of the things that we see on this slide are actually needed to be in place. One of the things is the physiological needs. And of course, if we kind of have all of our food, water, comfort, etc., paid attention to, then actually at a physiological level, we are surviving. The next step up, though, the safety needs, is where perhaps working therapeutically is very different to working in another model, which has a tendency to be a little punitive. This way, when people are working in an unsafe environment, they really don't begin to learn. They don't feel safe enough to be vulnerable, to open up, and to actually explore what is needed for them to learn not only about themselves, but also about living in a couple or indeed family relationship. So the Heart of England model and Temper DV works therapeutically in order to begin to address these safety needs, so that actually the person and persons can move from not just the physiological needs being met, but their safety needs also to be met. And then they can move on up through love and belonging, through esteem, and to the top of the triangle, which means that they can actually become the best person that they most would like to be. Some of the things that we do in Temper are actually exercises that will help the individuals to move up this triangle. And I think it's important to say that working with both men and women, because both men and women form relationships, is part of this learning. Neither are immune to the experiences of poor emotional regulation. Neither are immune to not being able to learn relationship skills. And indeed, neither are actually immune to experiencing trauma, whether that be inside a loving relationship or indeed outside a loving relationship. One of the things that Temper offers is a psychoeducational model. It provides tools for the individuals to learn so they can better understand not only the needs of themselves, but those of others. Working in closed groups, as Temper does, helps feelings of safety to develop. Without the feelings of safety, individuals can indeed get stuck and not grow beyond attending simply to their physiological needs and basic security needs. Temper's clients are often unaware of where they got stuck, of the skills they haven't as yet acquired in order to move from surviving through to thriving. To be wholly involved in their life, their partner's world, and to be the best parents that they can be is often the goal that we here, the men and the women that attend the course, wish for. So they want to move from the bottom of our triangle all the way up to the top of it. The exercises Temper has developed helps clients to change their state, their mind state, to change their stance, and through to changing the story that they have of themselves, to be able to receive compassion safely, to develop self-compassion so they can look after themselves and self-soothe, and to be able to receive compassion safely. So they're actually able to offer that compassion, which is the kernel and the beginnings of learning how to empathize, which is so necessary when we're working with couples and we're working with children. In working therapeutically with both men and women, not punitively, Temper offers the possibility of growth, understanding of others and self by providing a model of secure attachment. Many of our clients have experienced insecure attachments through a lack of trust and feelings of not being safe in the environments that they grew up in.
So if we move on to the next slide, Denise, essentially it's a developmental model. The little person on the right needing to adjust and develop towards a relational individual on the left. If you turn the whole of this model towards the right through 90 degrees, you will notice that positions D, C, B, and A pretty much correspond with the previous slide, which Denise just talked us through. The arrows linking D with C run in both directions, as do the arrows linking C with B and B with A. Down the left side, you'll see an arrow indicating increasingly difficult cases, and then you'll notice that the most difficult cases usually refer to the greatest lack of development. So at one level, our objective is to help people to move one step to their left developmentally, which you might call maturation, and then to focus on the issues which are raised primarily via these developmental steps. If you've had little children, you'll no doubt have had the experience of their becoming continent and then, during a period of stress, reverting to bedwetting. When the child regains their equilibrium or becomes safe again, then the bedwetting stops. You'll also notice references to Dan Siegel, essentially in the white boxes in Blueprint, and you'll notice that he's quoted in other places too. He's a professor of psychiatry and has become one of the number of very highly influential and important individuals. His contributions via extensive research and consultations have produced a working definition of emotions, verbs, not nouns, mental health, how positively to achieve it and work towards it rather than merely identify and diagnose it. And he has also focused on the need for the development of an autobiographical memory, a view of myself and others over time. He's also specified that in seeking to change behaviors, we are focused on the right prefrontal cortex. In many ways, Siegel has given the words and the concepts to a way of working which we had been largely using without knowing of his newly developed ideas. Of course, we have slowly merged our work more and more closely to his ideas as time has gone on. Preceding him, John Bowlby's work on attachment styles was and is a major influence on our focus. By studying young children and the ways they responded under stress, Bowlby developed theories about what have become heavily researched and somewhat enduring ways in which children and adults attach to others.
As trained couple counsellors, David and I are acutely aware of the couple dynamic and the couple fit, and how that can influence people's sense of safety and belonging. They are less likely to be avoidant of relationships and experience little anxiety about being in an intimate relationship if they have grown up and developed a secure attachment. Sadly, for many, those that actually don't grow up in these environments don't feel safe, and it's likely that they will become avoidant and or anxious in attaching to one another. The perceptions, actually real or imagined, of relationships is that they are threatening. And when they find relationships threatening, they feel insecure and they develop an attachment style which could be very low in avoidance but high in anxiety, and they can become then preoccupied in the way that they attach. People who fall into this category of attachment style actually are those that are quite clingy, those that are quite needy, and sometimes they can actually be very, very suspicious in relationships. They become preoccupied with being in a relationship, and they may be quick into relationships and slow out of them due to their very high anxiety levels, believing themselves unlovable, and therefore finding themselves staying in unhealthy relationships. If someone has high anxiety and is highly avoidant regarding relationships, they develop what's referred to as a fearful avoidance style, meaning they can be very scared of committing to any form of relationship, but at the same time wanting to be in it, craving to be in a relationship. Almost everything about an intimate relationship raises fear within them and can cause them to withdraw in a relationship and indeed not ever want to form a relationship. So somebody in this style may well actually withdraw from any intimacy within the relationship, or indeed not be able to manage any warmth coming towards them. And if someone is highly avoidant of a relationship and have very little anxiety, they can become what's referred to as dismissing and avoidant, believing that being in a relationship really isn't important or indeed necessary for them to thrive. They are likely to push people away because to admit to any vulnerability or need is just too terrifying. I think it's easy to see from these attachment styles that relationships can be very, very complicated, and forming them can be very, very scary. And because much of this happens at an unconscious level, individuals and couples can protect themselves by employing primal survival strategies, by fighting, by fleeing, withdrawing, and or by freezing, just closing down.
Looking at this, these are the three strands of work, an outline of the three strands of work to which we work. Essentially, starting at the bottom left, we work in all three directions whenever possible simultaneously. On the left-hand side, going vertically, is about the steps in developing behavior skills, responses as opposed to reactions, and developing several kinds of new behaviors which can be practiced extensively by an individual in their daily and future lives. Going horizontally across the bottom, you'll see cognitions. Understanding would be a simpler word. And again, there are a number of themes within this understanding. The third strand, going diagonally bottom left to top right, contains emotional steps and what we describe as the emotional thread. Through this therapeutic thread, clients will be engaged in exploring their own emotional makeup and being helped to recognize emotions going on in them, so that with those recognitions, they can learn to respond rather than to react. Controversially, as far as feminism is concerned, you can see from this diagram that we explore with clients their own difficult experiences in childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood. Often, this involves their own abuse or fearful situations in which they found themselves. In looking back like this, from an adult's perspective, the client develops or begins to develop their autobiographical memory. This often opens them to aspects of their life which were painful or very difficult, and this in turn helps them to draw conclusions about their own children's and partners' likely experiences in the situation in which they find themselves. From our point of view, these are the early steps in developing empathy, which you can see being the top level of strand C. So slide 9 is about emotions, and this is another part of our treatment model. Around 1998, Denise and I developed these ideas about emotions as a way of helping our clients to become more aware of the processes going on in themselves. Denise is going to talk mainly to this slide.
Thanks, David. Linking this slide back to the slides that we've previously seen, if we think about our clients, often they are not given the opportunity to think about the state that they find themselves in. And they're not often given the opportunity to make links to their primary emotions, thus helping them to develop some self-awareness and awareness of others. So one of the reasons that Temper will work with these emotions is to help people to understand the emotions not only within themselves, but also, as I've said earlier on, with emotions that others may be experiencing. And if we look at our emotion wheel, we can sort of look at this and see trust right at the top of it. And trust comes from having our attachments needs met in secure families and actually secure environments. And distrust feeds into our feelings of not being very secure, not being very safe, and that leads to the insecure attachments that I mentioned earlier on. The emotion of anger is linked to our survival strategy of fight, and the emotion of fear is linked to our survival strategy of flight. And if we look at shock, it is quite closely linked to the emotional state of comas and startle and all of those, but it puts us into that survival strategy of freeze, where we actually just stop. And in conflictual couples, if one of them is angry, the other is likely to be frightened, increasing the distance between them. And again, thinking about the dynamic in couples, if one person is frightened and withdraws, runs away, flees, the other person may become increasingly angry and actually want to follow them. All of these dynamics are then understood, and people can start to say, oh yeah, I behave like that, or that is exactly what happens in my relationship. By beginning to understand these states, these emotions, and what's going on inside them, our people are able to start to regulate these emotions. Temper invites clients to explore other emotions that could be triggering these basic primal survival strategies by asking them to sense what indeed is going on inside of them, alerting them to the early warning signs that they may be beginning to feel unsafe or threatened. By doing this, they're able to discover ways of deactivating their hyper or hypo arousal systems and enabling the possibility of remaining in that place where they, in the middle of this homeostatic state, where they can quickly and easily move around all of these emotions by identifying them and then explaining them. None of this work is gender specific. Men and women have these emotions. They have these survival mechanisms, and they have these attachment styles. It's a reason, or one of the reasons, that temper works with both men and women, because to give intimate relationships an equal platform and children a healthier model of emotional regulation and safety, we have to help others to understand what's going on in us, and we have to learn to understand what is going on in them.
At the bottom of this slide, there's information again emanating from Daniel Siegel, who is the American professor of psychiatry, who's produced a great deal of very useful work on the role and regulation of emotions. Denise and I developed this model in about 1998. Much later, we discovered that a Professor Klutchnik had produced something similar, but we think our model fits better with the way in which we see emotions flipping and changing.
We've all got these 8 primary emotions. There's no two ways about that. I think one of the things that we have recognized over the years of working with men and women is that many of our people are not allowed to be sad. They're not allowed to be frightened. So these emotions become really quite well suppressed, ignored by them. And they kind of, I will say, go into a jar that they've got inside them and they fester. And it kind of is a little bit like a pressure cooker. Eventually, the pressure grows too great. Their sadness and their grief may be too much. Their fears may be too huge. They can no longer contain them. And that's often when we see people behaving, not feeling, but behaving in a very angry way. So we have to look at behavior of anger and check out just exactly whether it is that person is angry or whether there is another emotion driving that. And that could be either sadness or fear. It might even be curiosity. They cannot understand what is going on. And so they lose their temper. They become annoyed. They become irritated. If we can help people to identify the driving emotion, the emotion that is driving their behavior, then we can actually help them to not only change their behavior, but understand how they got to this place. In order to sort of look at a reason that temper continues to work with both men and women, we have found research from Michael P. Johnson, who sort of gave this research in the early 2000s. And what this research here is showing us is that both men and women are capable of being abusive within relationships. And David will talk a little bit more to this. And the top table, table 2, is when we still have partners who are together, and the bottom table, which is table 1, is when a couple have separated. This research is really important and was really important, continues to be important, because a lot of the statistical evidence that is given out by the Office of National Statistics doesn't always drill down to this level.
This table 2, the top one, is about current relationships. It involves the results of research into, in round figures, 10,000 people. Okay, that's the N figure over on the right of the diagram. Firstly, he points out that 95% plus of men and 98% of women are never, ever violent. Firstly, an idea of what situational couple violence looks like. A difference of opinion arises. It could be trivial, where to sit on the beach, or it could be major. All couples face these arguments. The argument escalates and gets added to, and will tend to become more eyeball to eyeball, or involve one individual storming off, or physical pushing and shoving, and worse. Either party may become more aggressive as the situation becomes more and more heated. The argument or dispute involves both people, neither prepared to give in. So that's basically common situational couple violence. Intimate terrorism broadly says that one person gets everything exactly their own way, and any and every strategy is used to achieve that. So situational couple violence scores 3.9% by men and 1.7% by women, a ratio of 2 to 1. Intimate terrorism, he scores as, with a couple living together, spouse or partner, 7 men per 1,000 and 5 women per 1,000. Quite similar numbers. Now, when we move down to his table 1, all of a sudden those figures change very dramatically. Situational couple violence from men to women very nearly doubles. Situational couple violence from women to men more than doubles. The importance for me is in the vast difference in intimate terrorism. So when the couple are together, this is scored at 7 per 1,000 men and escalates post-separation to 22.6%. And for women, the intimate terrorism, whilst in the couple relationship, scores at 5 per 1,000, and post-separation moves to 5.4%. So an exponential increase in men and a significant increase in women. And one of the conclusions which we can draw from this is that the separation of couples escalates all rates of violence and abuse exponentially.
So I think it's important when we're looking at these figures to recognize that things can be on a continuum, and that it's along that continuum that we help our people to actually recognize how their emotional state, how their behaviors impacted by their emotional state is progressing and escalating, and then helping them to find ways of de-escalating and indeed being aware of what's going on inside them and also outside of them.
So this slide is really about a freedom of information, which I picked up from the Northamptonshire Police. In the early days, I just wanted to be sure that our thinking, or that what was going on in our heads, actually matched the reality. So the freedom of information was a way of doing that. And I approached Northamptonshire Police and the West Midlands Police, and I'm going to focus today on the Northamptonshire Police response, really. So I'm going to make some simple observations. In 2003-04, the police were called out to domestics by just over 4,000 men and about 6,000 women. Similarly, 2004-05, and then with an increase in 2005-06 to just under 5,000 call-outs by males and just under 7,000 call-outs by females. So at this point, I would just point out the similarity in proportions between Johnson's 7 per 1,000 men being intimate terrorists and 5 per 1,000 women being intimate terrorists. Not that these cases are about intimate terrorism, but it does give you an understanding of the proportion again, which is not quite matched by the ONC figures, but it's approaching them. So now with an arrest somebody policy, which began in 2005, 2006, the police started to act very differently. So they were instructed to arrest someone. So when we move on a little, 2009-10, you'll notice that the call-outs by men have shrunk very, very dramatically from about 4,000 to 5,000 to about 300. And the call-outs by women have shrunk somewhat from 7,000 to 2,000. On the scale of this slide, there is virtually no difference over the next 2 years.
What we can see prior to the change of policy is that men were calling maybe around 2/3 of the number of women that were calling. And when we look at the next set where the policy has changed, we can see now that men are calling maybe much less, maybe about 1/3 or 1/4 to that women were calling. So if we move on to the next slide, what we have here is the number of arrests, and I'm going to let David talk to that.
So what has happened? Well, obviously the police in the early days were being used to keep the peace. There were never any real consequences. The police attended, so that would have simply been repeated when either party required it. But by 2009 to 10, men have virtually stopped calling out the police. Why would that be? In part, some of the reason for this will be that they may expect to be arrested instead of the partner. And many partners will now also have learned that with the arrest policy in place, there are enormous risks to the couple relationship and to the family fortune and stability if the man is arrested, etc. Positive consequences for the police from this: much less involvement with DV equals savings and cost. Negative outcomes for radical feminism, perhaps many fewer potential clients coming forward, and therefore financial worries. A bit more about domestic violence statistics. This is a comprehensive review by Jennifer Lang-Hinrichsen-Rohlen, and it was based on a meta-analytic study of 49 other studies. So Jennifer's research paper focused on situational couple violence, it being bidirectional, and scored at 59.6%, so very nearly 60%, bidirectional, both individuals involved in the violence, often with the woman slapping the man or throwing something. Jennifer's research then established that 22.9% of domestic violence was unidirectional, female to male. And male violence then being scored at 17.5%. The proportions of this are really what is very interesting, that such a high proportion, fairly similar to Johnson's statistics, involve situational couple violence. And then the other startling result of this, that female unidirectional violence to men is actually more significant than male unidirectional violence to women, completely in contrast to what the feminist mantra says. Jennifer's paper is in line with more than 560 other papers which find similar outcomes. More than 80% of women become the resident parent in the acrimonious separations. The potential safety of children would seem to be potentially compromised by overlooking and ignoring the research, which in fact scores violence as more often reciprocal, or with women being more frequently violent to men than men to women. So where does that take us? Radical feminism has wanted and wants us to see all domestic violence as males to females. Radical feminism only wants there to be male abusers, which is why all of the programs in the UK, with the exception being of ours, are focused entirely on male perpetrators. The work to be undertaken according to that radical feminist narrative is in the power and control model. Unfortunately, there's a major fly in the power and control ointment. The fly is no less than the late Ellenpence, who originally designed the Duluth Abuser Program. In 1999, in her book, Duluth and Beyond, she had the honesty to admit that achieving power and control over a woman was a misplaced notion which she and her colleagues had almost accidentally built into their program. She openly admitted that she and her colleagues took every opportunity to challenge men that they were motivated by a desire for power and control over their female partner, and when they didn't agree with this, they were described as being merely in denial. Mr. Neil Blacklock of DVIP back in 2006 spoke on Radio Northampton with Denise here, and he indicated that less than 25% of the men that attended the DVIP, that's a program based in London, actually completed it. And Mirabel is still finding very, very small numbers of completions from 4 projects running at least 7 programs. I think it was 36 people. And I'm going to suggest now that the failure to change the program to engage better with men is actually done intentionally. In Ellenpence's book, Jacqueline Campbell, an early feminist writer, stated in 1997 that the domestic violence programs, i.e. the Duluth programs and DVIP that I've just mentioned, were an attempt to create a firewall against therapeutic practices. Those therapeutic practices, that is, didn't meet feminist objectives. All the accredited Duluth-style programs have had a long and well-documented history of major dropouts. Since the early programs were essentially trying to supervise a relationship, if the male perpetrator was reported violent with his partner, he was thrown off the program. So probably in an attempt to reduce their dropouts, they only allow separated men to attend. Accredited programs will not work with individuals who have not separated from their partner. For those few men who complete a program, the next hurdle is in the concluding report. In my professional opinion, Mr. X did not make the necessary changes. And with that, of course, the opportunity for developing contact with their children, or the opportunity for the children to develop contact with their father, is absolutely dead in the water. What became of Miss Hawley? An investigation, a complaint of bullying, 19 fundraisers having been sacked. I read with considerable interest and perhaps just a little schadenfreude an article in the Times in January 2019 illustrating Miss Hawley's pay package was still of the order of £210,000 to £220,000 per year. What did Miss Hawley fail to tell us in 1994? She failed to get the statistics right by what appears to have been a long way. In telling us about the 2 women per week on average killed by a partner or former partner, she omitted to tell us about the men killed. And even more importantly, she omitted to mention the children that are killed. And the statistics for the children are quite alarming. About 65 per year on average, killed in more or less equal numbers by their mothers and fathers. According to human rights legislation, each child has the right to a family life. By deliberately splitting couples and then holding only the man accountable for that is a fundamentally unjust and destructive strategy to all individuals involved in the family structure, particularly each child, and in the long run, society.
With everything that you've heard us talk about, with everything that we've presented to you, it's now, where do we go with this? What are we doing all of this for? The reduction of domestic abuse and violence that professionals are craving clearly isn't happening at the present time. Would this not suggest that current approaches are failing the vast majority of society that professionals are wanting to help? If all agencies and workers were involved in this endeavour could agree and face in the same direction, provide a united rather than a fragmented way of working, then the desired outcome of reducing domestic violence and abuse could be achieved.
Abusers are both males and females. Both need help to change their behaviours. Emotion drives behaviour, not a desire for power and control. And the dichotomized view of a female victim and a male perpetrator needs dropping. The need for safer families for children. This is not about women's rights, nor is it about men's rights. It is about children's rights for contact with their parents. Therapeutically informed practices understand the full range of behaviours being used and by whom. Progress for children is not helped by confronting males only and building firewalls against better practice or broadcasting unrepresentative data. Thank you very much indeed for listening. We hope that you found this talk informative and also helpful in helping you to understand the wider issues of domestic violence than are currently being presented by the narrative.